Um, we're going to be doing lesson 3 in our new series on lessons of Bible leadership or leaders in the Bible. And this week's lesson is going to be on courage. So I handed out handouts Wednesday night. I know some people here have them, some people don't. If you want one, raise your hand. This is just discussion questions. And then I also have handouts for next week's lesson, lesson 4. Volunteer. This one is 2 pages for anybody that wants it. And then at the end of class, I'll hand out the one for next week for lesson 4. So appreciate y'all doing that. And again, these lessons come from this book, 21 Qualities of Leaders in the Bible, John Maxwell book. He wrote a lot about leadership, both for church and for business. But one thing I want to be clear on, this lesson is not just for, leadership in the supervisor or management type sense. It's how can we be an influence in everybody's lives. Leadership is basically having a positive influence on people and being able to lead them to doing better things. So as Christians, we can be leaders no matter what kind of job title we have or what kind of responsibilities you have in the local church. But you get to have a leadership influence to guide people to do the right thing, influence people to walk closer to God. Appreciate Kent last week's class on communication. Sorry I missed that while I was out of town in South Carolina. But I know that does a good job with class, has a lot of really good thoughts and comments, and appreciate that. So the lesson on courage. Each one of these lessons has 3 case studies, and we'll spend a majority of our time looking at the case studies. For this week, we're going to look at Joshua, his courage. We're going to look at Elijah on Mount Carmel, and we're going to look at Esther. Now recently, if you've been here, Bill's had a lot of lessons on Joshua, especially chapter 1 on being bold and courageous. And then recently we had another sermon on Elijah. Again, similar topic about being bold. So we'll go over those fairly quickly, and we'll spend a lot of our time talking about Esther. We haven't really talked about Esther lately. So to get into the class, what is courage? How would you define courage? What's that? Fearless? Well, let's dive into that. Does having courage mean that you don't have any fear? I think the definition we want to look at is taking action despite fear that you have. And really, when we think about courage, in our culture, you have a lot of, action figures in movies. Think about Braveheart. Yeah, and, that's what I think about, courage. The characters in Braveheart, going up against all odds, and Spartacus, lots of other heroes like that. But, courage, we could have courage in our daily life because we aren't really going to be in the same situations as Braveheart or those other action movies. We aren't ever going to be leading a charge of cavalry against, an enemy holding swords and bows and arrows and things like that. I know there's people here that have been in law enforcement and the military that might have been in those situations, but majority of us aren't going to have to use that kind of courage. I think we can take lessons from the Bible where there were people facing down violence, and we can take lessons and apply that to other situations where we have to have courage in our daily lives. So courage doesn't mean not having fear. That means taking action in spite of that fear and doing good things, being bold. People that have courage usually have the same amount of fear as other people, rational fear. It's rational to have fear when you're up against odds. And then there's irrational fear. You don't have to imagine risk everywhere, imagine enemies, but it's okay to have rational fear that something might happen. That's logical. But courage is taking action despite those fears. Now, what would be an example of taking courage as a Christian in our everyday lives? Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep. And I'll repeat that comment so everybody could hear it. Ms. Joyce says, an example of courage is when you might go up and talk to somebody and not know how they're going to react. What else?
There's a certain amount of courage to just knock on the door, because you don't know what's on the other side.
Yep. Courage to knock on a door, not knowing what's on the other side. You know, there's a lot of unknowns when you interact with people. You know, another example might be, say you're in a social setting or you're at work, and, you know, people are talking how a Christian ought not to talk, or might be saying something that's, you know, disrespectful to Jesus or God, and you want to step up and say, hey guys, let's show some respect, let's not talk like that, or having the courage not to join in on those type of things. So a lot of our courage is just in interacting with people that might be, you know, responding in a unpredictable way or in a way that's not, you know, comfortable for a Christian. I'll share a personal example. You know, I've taught before, you know, majority of my 20s, I wasn't living as a Christian. You know, got into lots of trouble and, you know, running around with wild crowds and, you know, participating in a lot of stuff I shouldn't have done. But I remember where I was living at the time, there was a Church of Christ that I would often pass by. And I would often pass by there with a guilty conscience. You know, might go past there, you know, hungover some days, thinking, you know, I should really be there. I'm hungover on a Sunday morning, but I really need to go in there to the church. And I passed by this church for months and months and months. And then later on I realized, you know, I'm in a self-destructive path. I need to start doing things better. And, you know, after several months, I finally went in there. And honestly, I was pretty intimidated. You know, knowing I was not living a Christian life will turn it around. And when I think back, that's one of my, you know, more fearful times, re-entering the church's atmosphere, fearing that I was going to go and be judged. And I knew I was doing wrong, and I was just afraid of the, you know, interaction there. But the church was loving, open arms. It was a great encouragement as I tried to go and turn some things around. So I share that because when we take courage in our lives, we also have the chance to encourage others. We have the chance to give other people courage as well. So there might be somebody that comes in that's been going through a rough time, that needs to turn their life around, that needs to clean up. We don't know that they're exercising a whole bunch of courage to walk in the door. If we are encouraging to them, that could help them to take courage to continue walking with God and turning themselves around. So all that to say, courage is not leading a charge with your sword out in front of you and an army behind you. That's courage in the movies, and that's not the kind of daily courage that we need to be building up. We need to be building up the courage where we could go and interact with people in a positive way, and we need to have the kind of courage that gets us out of our comfort zone to go and help others when they need that kind of help and encouragement and edification. There's a quote in this book by Billy Graham. It says, "Courage is contagious. When a brave man takes a stand, the spines of others are stiffened." So if you step out there and you take courage to stand up and do the right thing, you never know who's watching that. Your acts of courage could help other people be bold and be courageous, you know, just like these case studies that we're going to get into. So when we demonstrate courage, it could encourage others to take a stand also. So any thoughts about the definition of courage, why we need it, or what it looks like before we get to the case studies? Any thoughts? All right, so let's turn to Joshua chapter 1. And again, I think this is going to be more of a supplement for a lot of Bill's lessons that he's given on Joshua. Might be a first time a discussion for some. Let's turn to Joshua chapter 1, and let's just read the first 9 verses together and get the whole context. So this is when we have a transfer of authority. Moses has died. The Israelites are about to enter Canaan. Joshua, not only is he stepping into a new position of authority, but he's about to lead the Israelites on their next chapter, entering the promised land. And when they enter the promised land, they aren't walking down a red carpet, are they? They're going to be walking amongst their enemies on all sides. So he really has a triple challenge. Take on the leadership, lead the Israelites to a new land, and then lead them in battle against their enemies. So this isn't a really peaceful transfer of power, promoting somebody to a boss. This is a triple challenge for Joshua. Let's read together Joshua chapter 1, verse 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, just as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites to the great sea, toward the going down of the sun shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Just as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may have good success wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have a good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So, how many times does God say, be strong and courageous to Joshua? Anybody counting as we read that? 3 times. Mrs. Ollie holds up the 3. So God really drives that home. Joshua has a triple challenge, and God reassures him 3 times, be strong and courageous, and tells him how he's going to be with him, and gives him some specifics. So we turn to the study questions on the handout. Let's talk through that together. Again, I don't want this to be a lecture. I want us to talk and learn from each other and share some thoughts. Question 1 reads, Joshua, along with Caleb, had seen the promised land before. The first time God directed the Israelites to cross over the Jordan, 40 years before, Joshua had been one of the spies. But the people had refused. How do you think Joshua had felt about what God was telling him to do this time? If you were in Joshua's shoes, how would you be feeling about being told to go in the promised land 40 years after the people had said that we are too weak and powerless to go in the promised land?
After his previous experience, probably wondering, are they going to follow?
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to stand behind me? It shouldn't matter to me if God is following them.
Yep.
So,
Yeah, I think that's a really reasonable way that he would have been thinking about it. We were too cowardly to do it before, and we do it now. Think Joshua had any fear? I'm sure he had fear. I think he was thinking, I'm about to lead all these people. How do I know they're going to follow me? How do I know we aren't going to get part of the way there and we aren't going to have a rebellion? There's rebellions in the wilderness. We read about that in the book of Numbers, when the Israelites rebelled and split off. What do you think made Joshua bold this time? He knew the Lord was behind him. God's giving direct reassurance. And hopefully Joshua was also thinking about the miracles in the wilderness. Larry?
Like marching 40 years through the wilderness because I think the first time they didn't do it.
What was that?
Marching 40 years through the wilderness because it did not go the first time had anything to do with his service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's not do this all over again. Let's do it right the second time around. So God clarified how he would support, and God had also been providing miracles continuously throughout the journeys in the wilderness. I think Joshua, and we're kind of bleeding over into question 2 also, talking about his fear. Do you think Joshua had any self-doubt about his own abilities?
I think that any reasonable person would.
Yeah, I guess any reasonable person would. I want to dive into that a little bit. Because again, one of the key words is reasonable fear versus more unreasonable fear. It's reasonable for Joshua to say, what if I mess up? What if I use the wrong words? Moses had the same doubts. God said that he would give him words. Moses lost his temper. Moses, he lost his temper and broke the first tablets of the law. Moses was very human. And I'm sure Joshua was saying, what am I going to do? I'm going to use the wrong words. I'm going to have some missteps. I'm going to lose people's confidence. That's what reasonable people think. We're all human. What's unreasonable is to say, be I'm going to be terrible. I'm going to drive it in the ground. I'm going to get us lost. I'm going to get us defeated. If you're unreasonable fear, you defeat yourself before you get started. But if you have, reasonable fear, you think about how to manage that and how to take courage despite your fear. So parallels in our life. It is reasonable, as we talked about, to have fear when we talk to people for the first time. It's reasonable to have some intimidation if you're facing down a hostile crowd that, is not friendly to Christians. It's unreasonable to say, well, I can't do anything because I'm going to be defeated, therefore I'm going to go and give in to my fears. Yep. He knew he was responsible. I'm sure that was a big motivating factor. Yep. So Joshua knew he had that responsibility, is Miss Joyce's comment. I think it'd also be reasonable for him to be afraid of the unknown in Canaan. They spied out the land. They knew a little bit about the inhabitants, but they didn't have ongoing surveillance. There's a lot of mysteries there. But again, all those are reasonable fears that you could use to make a logical game plan with how you're going to go and manage things moving forward and how you're going to act with courage despite your fears. So being courageous doesn't mean that you're ignorant about the things that you should be mindful of. It means that you make a game plan and you move forward with it. And again, none of us are going to lead a nomadic people across the wilderness and into hostile territory and battle. But we take lessons from Joshua. I'll make a point, then we'll get to you, Donnie. Try to lead a congregation of people? Yeah, that's a parallel. Shepherding a flock through the modern wilderness. Because, even though we aren't fighting against people with bows and arrows, there's a lot of hostility. We definitely have a spiritual battle. But yeah, the main thing is we got to take courage. We got to reason through the things we're afraid of and have a game plan with what we're going to do. And that doesn't mean charging blindly or ignorantly into a battle. It means having a plan and knowing how you'll react. I think we got to watch out for pearls before swine moments. There's definitely situations where it would be foolish to engage. Yeah, you often see, in the news, mobs and, protests and stuff like that. If there is a big pro-abortion crowd, marching down the street, I don't think it would be foolish to jump in the middle of the crowd and start quoting Bible verses. That would probably do more harm than good. There's times we've got to watch out for pearls before swine, but then there is other times we might be intimidated to talk to people and have an impact, but we can still have a meaningful accomplishment if you take courage. In the interest of time, I want to see if there's any other comments on Joshua before we go to Elijah. Donnie?
I just wanted to point out what it said in the last part of chapter 1.
Mm-hmm.
After God talks to Joshua, then Joshua commanded the people to do what God told him to do. And in verse 16, it says, so they answered Joshua, saying, all that you command us we will do. Wherever you send us, we will go. Just as we heeded Moses in all things, so we will heed you. Only the Lord your God
And that's a good point. From a leadership perspective, both, business leadership and church leadership, getting people started is the easy part. Keeping people going is a hard part. Keeping up motivation, keeping up initiative, that's the hard part. Sustaining that over time. Larry, did you have your hand up?
I was just going to say, Joshua wasn't totally ignorant of his enemies. He was one of the spies that went into the land and checked it out. And he gave them confidence in, yes, we can take the land. But the majority said, no, we can't. But sometimes when you're in the minority and you're right, you got to stand for what's right. Even though you're talking about the crowd of, pro-abortion. Might not be a good time to raise up a lot of Bible verses, but at the same time, you can talk to them one-on-one, so why do you think this way? It's a life after so many days that you're taking a life. So what's the difference between someone shooting you and taking that life and you going to church and taking that life? So, you have to reason with a logical claim sometimes, and sometimes they're illogical. There's no reasoning with some people.
Yeah.
You got to try.
And that's a good point. You have to have a tailored approach to different situations. Different people are going to listen to different lines of reasoning. Some people just got to ask questions and listen so you could understand them better, so then you know what kind of approach you need to take. Yeah, that all goes back to having, being able to make a plan. We aren't going to have a plan for everything, but you got to be able to go and evaluate and think, how am I going to handle this situation? How am I going to look at this risk and this danger and still take courage to lead in a positive way? Any other comments on Joshua before we turn to the case study of Elijah? All right, so 1 Kings 18. We aren't going to read this passage. I'll just recap it. So we're going to talk about the example of Elijah and the contest with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. So the setting is, we're under the reign of King Ahab in the Israel northern kingdom. Ahab and Queen Jezebel are some of the wickedest leaders, and they have been persecuting the faithful prophets so much that another prophet named Obadiah leads prophets to hiding in caves. So everybody is being persecuted, prophets are hiding, they are trying to escape with their lives, and then pagan worship, specifically Baal, is all over the place. An extremely corrupted period of time. Elijah is called to go out of hiding and to go get out in the open. So think, first of all, that setting. We read about that in the Roman Empire and the period of Acts, where there is active persecution, similar situation here. And that's not out of the realm of possibility in our country. There's definitely a lot of hostility towards Christianity. And, two sets of laws sometimes based off of what you believe and how people are prosecuted under the law. So Elijah is called to go and confront Ahab. And if Ahab wanted to, he could have killed Elijah right then and there. That's how hostile they are. So Elijah sets up a contest himself against prophets of Baal. Anybody know how many prophets of Baal? 450. So what odds? 1 versus 450. So they go up to Mount Carmel. The contest is which God could call down fire from heaven and set the sacrifice on fire. So 1 versus 450.
Actually, 850 because we're also the prophets of Ezra.
I'm sorry?
850 because the prophets of Ezra were there too.
Good point. More than that. Thanks for that detail. 850 altogether. So, even more. So, what are the risks? What are the odds? And then Elijah, he puts himself at a disadvantage also. So while they are trying to set their altars on fire, he taunts them. He says, "Is your God sleeping? And then when it's Elijah's time, he against everybody else, what does he say? He brings water. Pour water on my sacrifice 3 times. So he puts himself at further disadvantage. And then when he prays in verse 37, verse 36, so this is after everything's set up. Elijah prays and he says, at the time of sacrifice, the prophet Elijah stepped forward and prayed, Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. And then the fire of the Lord fell and burned up the sacrifice, and then the prophets, the pagan prophets, were executed. But what does Elijah pray for? He prays for success. Why does he pray for that success? So that Elijah won't die? He prays for that success so that, he says, so people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again. So his prayer to God is not for his own defense. His prayer is so that people will see and understand. So first question here, how much courage did it take for Elijah to call for a showdown between him and all the pagan prophets?
I'm not sure in Elijah's case the courage even comes in, because there's probably very few more faithful people in the Bible than he. And he wasn't really doing this of his own will, because in verse 32 he said, this is what you've asked me to do as he's praying.
Mm-hmm.
So God obviously told him, you do this and it's all taken care of. Now, I mean, and not that there isn't self-doubt and that kind of thing, but you can just tell the way this goes. It's one of my favorite stories in the Bible. He knows what's going to happen, and he's not even concerned about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's just like when the Israelites went into the Promised Land, they didn't need an army. God could have done it with one. He could have done it with none. But, Elijah just shows all sorts of just pure, unadulterated faith
Mm-hmm.
when he does these things.
Yep.
But sure, if there's any self-doubt at all, when you're looking at 850 prophets of false gods, yeah, that could be a little concerning.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll just try and boil that down. Elijah's faith was, we could read it as Elijah's faith is so great that his fear, that his self-doubt was insignificant. It didn't slow him down. Of course, we don't know everything that he was thinking. I think that he would have logical fear looking at the same numbers, but his faith is so much greater than that fear. Easy for him to have nerves of steel knowing that God is behind him. And I think it's okay to be afraid in these situations, but it's not okay to let your fear hold your faith back. It is not okay to say, I'm going to not obey God because my fear is greater than my faith. We don't need to turn there, but Matthew 14, when Jesus is walking on water, Peter comes out to walk with him. It says that Peter was afraid, he began to sink, and then what did Jesus say? Did Jesus say, Peter, why are you afraid? What does Jesus say? Where is your faith? He doesn't say, why are you afraid? He says, where is your faith? Matthew 14, Peter, what happened first? Was he afraid first, or did he lose his faith first? The way that the narrative is written, I read it as his faith failed, and then his fear took over, and then he sank. Because Jesus says, where is your faith? He doesn't ask him why he's afraid. So in the case of Elijah, that faith that is just so strong, it overpowers that fear. And that trust in God helps you go through and obey and do God's will. What would have happened to Elijah if God had not answered his prayer?
He would have lost the challenge.
He would have lost a challenge. What goes along with losing the challenge? Yep, he'd be killed. Do you think that'd be a quick, humane death? Remember how fearful everybody was. And knowing what we know about Jezebel, she was a sadist. Elijah most likely would have been killed slowly, torturously, made an example of. he'd be one of those deaths where, his body split open, he's hung up on the wall of a city to die and be pecked at by the birds. Ahab had a long history of killing prophets in torturous ways. So, some of the lessons from here, we need to be able to take on the challenges boldly. Be aware of the opportunities. Elijah didn't issue this contest behind closed doors. This was very public. It's an opportunity, and again, he prayed that the people would know. This is an opportunity for people to see and take heart and be encouraged. Thinking back to that Billy Graham quote earlier, when somebody shows courage, it stiffens the spines of others. Think about how Elijah's example could stiffen the spines of some of the other prophets that were living in caves. Any further thoughts on Elijah? All right, so we've got about 15 minutes left. Let's turn to Esther. We've talked about Elijah and Joshua lately, but we have not talked about Esther, to my knowledge, lately. So, if you think a piece of trivia about the book of Esther, what's a piece of trivia you think about? Esther is the only book in the Bible that what? Right. Esther is the only book in the Bible that does not name God. Does that mean that there is no God in Esther? Does that mean that God is not involved in Esther? I think Esther is a good book about providence. How would we define providence? We could talk about providence and courage also. Does anybody have a definition of providence? God providing. How do we define a miracle? I'd say a easy definition of miracle is when God temporarily changes the laws of nature or works around the laws of nature to show us something for various reasons. God did a miracle when he raised Jesus from the dead. He temporarily changed the laws of nature to physically revive the human body of Jesus. When Jesus and Peter walked on water, God temporarily changed the laws of nature so they could walk on water. Providence, the definition I would share, and y'all could add or challenge me on this, is when God works in our world in hidden ways that doesn't change nature. We don't always see his presence. We don't see what he does, but we know that he's working. And things are positively changed for us. I think that's a fair definition of providence, or anybody want to add to it or challenge that?
I don't want to challenge it. I agree with it. But there's something in there that I've always thought about the prophets that I've never been able to answer. And I think I'm not able to answer because God is the answer to it. If we just cannot tell God what to do, so if God wants to work in nature, or if he wants to use nature, go outside nature in his providence, he has that very right to do so. And I think what life does is trusting that he will do that.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and that's
God work, let God work, the Holy Spirit work if you want to. You know, I'm talking about raising people from the dead or anything. It's way out there.
Yep. Yeah, exactly right. That's well said. So God has the ability and every right to work in this world as he sees fit to further his will and help us to obey and help us be strong and courageous at times. So,
Kind of add to that. It's when God takes action in ways that we don't understand to his will.
yep.
Whatever it is he wants to do, he's going to make happen however he does it.
So when God takes action to do his will in whatever way. So I say all that, God is not named in Esther, but Esther is a good example of providence because all the things that happen, there's a high danger situation where basically all the Jews could be wiped out. And this is also the book where they were first called the Jews. Israelites are called the Jews from here on. So they're in danger of being totally obliterated, but God, through providence, preserves them. All of these things work out for their good. So all that, I want to get into the backstory and keep providence in mind, and how does God use providence to help preserve the Jews? How does God use providence to help Esther take courage to play her part? So the background, this takes place in the Persian Empire. And the king at that time, different ways to say his name, Ahasuerus, different ways. I don't know if I can pronounce the name right. I'll just call him the king. I didn't practice saying his name. So the king ends up banishing his previous queen and then choosing Esther to be the next queen. Esther has been raised by her cousin Mordecai, as she's been orphaned. Mordecai was in exile. He came from Judea. He remembers that time there, and Mordecai is one of those guys that helps to preserve the faith, following the Mosaic law and following the Jehovah God. So along the way, there is a kind of a toady to the king named Haman, who is high and mighty. He gets promoted. He wants everybody to bow to him. Chapter 3, Mordecai does not bow to Haman, and that's kind of like Nebuchadnezzar that we read about in Daniel. When you bow to the king, you're treating them like a deity. Haman was a kind of a high-up official of the king that wanted to be treated like he was a deity. Mordecai, as a faithful follower of Jehovah, refused to bow to Haman, and then Haman wanted to take it out on all the Jews and hatched the plot on one day they would all be slaughtered, not just where they were, but across the whole Persian Empire. So Mordecai knows that Esther, his cousin, that he has raised, is married to the king, and that is an opportunity. So let's turn to Esther chapter 4 with a bit of the background. And again, if anybody wants to fill in more of the story, feel free, just keeping it at a high level for the sake of time. So Mordecai sends for Esther, and he wants Esther's help to petition the king to call off the plan to slaughter the Jews. Esther chapter 4, verse 12. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said, and this is a back and forth sending messages. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. Let's back up. Mordecai sends a message to Esther saying, go petition the king. Esther says, if I go unto the king unsolicited, I'll be killed. Esther chapter 4, verse 10. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's providences know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. So we'll pause right there. First study question is, what does it say about the leadership culture of Persia that anyone who approached the king without being summoned would be executed unless the king gave the sign holding out the scepter to do otherwise? What kind of leadership culture is that? It's what we would call authoritarian or totalitarian, right? The king's word is law. There isn't any set right or wrong. It's just what the king feels. So if somebody approaches a king and the king doesn't want to talk to him, if the king's in a bad mood, they can say, execute them right away. So that's not a real open leadership structure at all. It's subjective. It also shows that life had little value at that time. The king could just pick and choose who they want to kill. That doesn't, say anything about the value of life or the quality of life at that time. So Mordecai sends to Esther, and they're sending messages back and forth. Says, Esther, you're close to the king, you're the queen. You need to go talk to him and get him to change this plan to go and slaughter all of our people. And then Esther writes back and says, I'm afraid to do that. He hasn't sent for me. If I go talk to him, he'll kill me. He might kill me. So do you think that's a reasonable fear for her to have? So how does Mordecai respond? Does he respond in a real authoritarian way, say, I've raised you, you need to do what I say, march back in there and talk to the king? He doesn't threaten her or anything like that. Let's read his response, resuming in verse 12 of Esther 4. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. And then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace, you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" So his response, he's not threatening her, but he reminds her what's at stake. And to paraphrase again with the context of courage for the lesson, says, Esther, you need to take courage because the well-being of all of our people is at stake here. This isn't about your life. This is about the life of all the people. Then really powerful statement, who knows whether you've been sent to the kingdom for such a time as this? Getting back to providence. You never know if you're where you're at for a reason. Where you're at, God might have arranged for you to be exactly where you're at that time because you could have an impact, show spiritual leadership to other people. I think providence, we don't read the name of God in Esther, but we do see providence where God put Esther where she was so that she could go and talk to the king and work out a plan to save the Jews. And then skipping ahead, I think we know the result. Esther did go to the king. He held out the scepter. He showed her favor. He did not kill her. So again, providence. Providence where God helped the king be soft-hearted at that time and not execute Esther, and then have an open heart and an open mind to listen to what she said and talk about the plans. So again, when we are facing danger, when we take courage, who knows what kind of providence God is using with the other people. If we go out of our comfort zone and take courage to talk to somebody who's in need, God could be using providence to strengthen ourselves, to strengthen our spine and our heart and give us words. God could also be using providence to soften the heart of whoever we're talking to, just like God softened the heart of the king here in Esther. Thoughts on that?
She was willing to talk to the king in the last part of verse 16. Said, "If I perish, I perish."
Yep. So she's a bit resigned there, huh? So, do you think Esther had reasonable fear to go and approach the king? I think it's reasonable fear. But she also realized that if I perish, I perish. She can't control everything, so she should go and do what's right for the sake of her people. Then I think we know how the story turns out. Long story short, everything backfires on Haman. Turns out that the good deeds that Mordecai has done to save the king come to the light. The king wants to honor Mordecai. And all the bad deeds that Haman has done to be conniving behind the scenes come to light. And Haman is executed on the same gallows that he erected for Mordecai. So in the last 2 or 3 minutes of class, let's take a step back and think about all these three people. So Esther, Joshua, and Elijah. What was at stake for all three of them when they took these risks? Their lives. Death was at stake for all three of them. What encouraged all three of them? How did they keep their spines straight and stiff? Faith. They had faith. They had strong belief in Jehovah. They knew. They didn't just believe in God. They didn't just believe that God was all-powerful and could protect them, but they also knew that they were doing these things for a reason. Nothing they did was arbitrary. Joshua leading the people, Isaac with the contest against the pagans, Esther against the king and the Persians. They all had a purpose. They all had a mission. So again, we don't have our mission laid out to us, and we don't have everything spelled out for us from God like they had, but we know that we have an overall mission, seek and save the lost and obey God. So we have that, and we need to remember that whenever we take courage to do the right thing for God, we aren't doing it for our own good. We're doing that so we could ultimately be obedient to God and serve Him and further the kingdom. So I hope with these things we could take heart. And again, we'll never be facing down an army of swords and bows and arrows, but we'll be facing hostile enemies that are, against the faith. Kent?
Yeah, I was gonna say, that's what all three of them had in common. They had a personal connection with God.
Personal connection with God. Yep.
How do we have that today? His word. That's our personal connection. And like you said, that's what it takes. And you talked about mission. They had a mission, so do we.
Yep.
You just mentioned that, so, good point.
Yeah, and thanks, Ken. That's a good way to segue to the conclusion. So the first lesson was about conviction, holding firm to our faith and having that as a motivator. Second lesson on communication, we got to be able to talk to people, have a plan, be able to understand people's needs. Then here we got to have courage. Our ability to communicate and our conviction isn't going to add up to anything leadership-wise if we don't take courage to act against our fears and to do good things even when we have some intimidation or fear. So everybody, thanks for your class. Thanks for all the comments, and looking forward to next week. So I'll start handing some of these out, and appreciate everybody's comments.